What evidence would you need to see to be able to see Jesus as having come and be the Messiah that was prophesied?
I don't know, that's hard because we're talking 2,000 years already.
For 2,000 years now, it seems that everyone has been talking about Jesus and an informed decision about Jesus. This is the biggest decision of your life, and let's investigate Jesus together. Hey everybody, and welcome to a special episode on the Investigate Jesus podcast. Today I'm excited that we have an interview, and I'll introduce our guest here in just a second. But for those of you who are new to the channel, remember our objective is to investigate Jesus, to help us make an informed decision about him. And to really know Jesus, we have to realize that Jesus was a Jewish man. And to understand him in the New Testament, to understand him as a Jew, we need a Jewish perspective. And so my guest today is Rabbi Albert Slomovitz. And I'm thoroughly excited for you to get to meet him, to get his perspective. The Rabbi and I disagree on some things, very likely, but we have found that it's very helpful to get different perspectives to help you understand better what you believe and to sharpen each other. And because Jews and Christians share a spiritual descent, we should be able to learn from each other. And so right now I'd like to welcome my friend, Rabbi Albert Slomovitz. Rabbi, thank you so much for being with us today. I am, as I have told you before, very excited about this specific conversation, which I hope really could be one of many, because you have such a unique perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for those who are tuning into this interview and haven't watched our other interview, just recently we also did an interview to talk about anti-Semitism and how Christians and even other non-religious people can help support their Jewish friends during a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise. And so we want to be supportive in that. So if you haven't checked that out, we'll put a link in the description and people can go watch that interview as well. That was a really good one.
Good.
So thank you for being here. Enough of me talking at this point. I want to just open up and maybe if you could just share a little bit about your bio, education, experience, and what's led you to here. And we'll go from there.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah. It's always great to chat with people on these subjects. People always want to talk about other things, and these are so fundamental to all of us. But the short story is I was in college in Florida, and my rabbi encouraged me to go to what's called the Joint Program, which is Columbia University and the Jewish Theological Seminary, which I did. And then I transferred to another seminary. And by the way, it takes 5 years after college to become a rabbi. So many people said, should have become a doctor, but I wasn't interested in becoming a doctor. Yeah. The day that I was ordained, I joined the Navy as a chaplain. Really? And served there for 20 years. Wow. And that was just wonderful because you're living in an interfaith environment. It's not touted as interfaith, but when you think about it, you're serving everybody. Yeah. And so even though we were rabbis, priests, and ministers, we were chaplains for everybody. So that was a great beginning for anybody interested in interfaith work. Yeah. And I was able to supplement that while I was in Chicago. I attended Loyola University of Chicago, and I had 2 postgraduate degrees, second master's in interfaith relations, and my PhD in American history. Wow. So I left the Navy with this really wonderful background, the academic background and the life experience background.
Yeah, very practical.
Of interfaith work. Retired from the Navy at a relatively young age, came to the Atlanta area, started a synagogue in Alpharetta, began teaching at Kennesaw State University American history. About 6 years ago, I received a calling in a way. Just a thought occurred to me that, gosh, I was observing anti-Semitism in the world and realized that I would probably have a unique perspective because of the military experience and the academic background from Loyola. Mm-hmm. So it came together in the book, A New Look at Rabbi Jesus, Jews and
Yes.
Christians Finally Reconnected. And I thought a lot about that title. It says 2 points I was trying to make. One is Rabbi Jesus, that he was called a rabbi, and so we can talk a little bit about what that means. And the Jews and Christians finally reconnected because I felt that we had become separated over time. And when you're separated, that's not good. That leads to prejudice, misunderstandings, etc. Book was published, and a friend challenged me and said, the book is good, but that's not enough. I said, what do you mean? And he said, you really need to do more. I thought about it, I prayed about it, and that led to the Jewish Christian Discovery Center, which is my nonprofit, which has been going on for 6 years. And the whole point of that, and we do it in a myriad of ways, the whole point of that is to sit with our Christian friends and talk about some of the things you're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about today the Jewishness of Jesus and the relevancy of that. So this is not academic. This is a very real subject, and I think your earlier announcement about anti-Semitism connects with what we're doing today. I mean, how does that exist? Yeah. And that exists, I think, based on a lot of the misunderstandings and misperceptions people have about Judaism, and that ignorance can easily lead to hatred and prejudice. So.
Well, that is a fantastic overview, and I know we've piqued the interest of several who are watching right now, hopefully many. I want to... Well, first of all, let me thank you for your service in the Navy, and I think that clearly played a very instrumental role in your own work today.
Right.
Could we go back to the beginning? Because I know that many watching right now who do not have a Jewish background, or maybe have not associated with many Jewish people in their life, may have some I don't know, misunderstandings of what it looks like to be Jewish. What does it look like for Albert Slomovitz, before the rabbi, just Albert Slomovitz, growing up? What did your childhood years look like? What did your journey of faith look like?
Well, in many ways, it was very typical. I mean, if you take any kid, that I went to public school, and then in afternoons, one afternoon, actually for me, it was 2 afternoons a week, I would go to religious school. So you'd go to public school and then be driven over to the synagogue. And then we're part of a synagogue. So I had a bar mitzvah. When you're 13, you have the ceremony. And then I attended youth group. So it was very typical along the way. Yeah. And then when I got to college, I had 2 years of junior college in South Florida. And that's when I started feeling myself drawn a little bit toward the synagogue, and so that moved to New York for me, attending Columbia and the Jewish Theological Seminary. That was a transformative process. But I will say, up to that point, my education was probably like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people have. Just going to religious school, going through the ceremonies, going to synagogue, etc.
So clearly this wasn't just a cultural thing for you. Like this was something that you believe, which makes me assume that your family, your parents, were very active in their synagogue, or at least getting you into synagogue and around your faith at an early age, not just culturally Jewish. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and of course. In my youth group, for example, we were part of a very large synagogue. To show you how large, we had 400 teenagers in the youth program alone. So I think, as you can imagine, for any church or synagogue, one of the reasons you're sending the kids there is for them to get those religious values which counter some of the social values of the time. So I think, and of course, you're a teenager, you're looking for the dances and the get-togethers and things like that. Yeah. So I think it's multi levels here going on. So in many ways, it was a combination of those factors. And I will add that when I first started in my program of Columbia in the seminary, it wasn't to become a rabbi, it was to become an educator. And one summer, my girlfriend's rabbi was going away on vacation. He said to me, take over services. Wow. I said, but I'm just doing the education part, not the services. He said, it doesn't matter. This is a short service. You can do it. And I did, and I found that I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of the process of following that pathway. So I think a lot of times in our lives we have those moments that occur that you look back to them and you say, oh, I didn't realize that this was all part of a longer faith journey.
Yeah, no, that's so great. And that sounds like a defining moment for you. Were there any other defining moments that you had where this wasn't just the faith of your family and ancestors, this wasn't just the faith of your friends, this became your faith?
That's a good question. Honestly, for me, it was an evolving process. So when I attended, I started out as an educator, and then I went to seminary. But just to let you know that at that time, there were only a few major seminaries you could go to. And if you weren't accepted, one was very traditional. And so that wasn't for me because that wasn't my practice. There was only two others. And I applied to one, and they said I was going undergraduate. They said spend another year, and I didn't want to do that. So I applied to the only one available for me, and I got in, fortunately. But had I not gotten in, I don't know what I would have done at that stage. So I think that a lot of time in life, right place, right time works. And again, if we look at it from a different perspective, maybe this is all part of the divine plan, the way it worked. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I will say that my faith evolved over time. I'll just give you a quick example. I mean, so I went to undergraduate 5 years because I was going to two schools, then was ordained 5 years later. So my thesis, as senior at my seminary, you have to do a thesis, an extended project. And I loved medieval scholasticism, Maimonides, St. Thomas Aquinas, that sort of thing, which is going far afield a little bit. But
well, it's great to mention both of those names in the same sentence.
yes, yes. So that was my interest. And so my senior thesis was, there was a Hebrew commentary that one of the medieval philosophers had written about the book of Ecclesiastes, for every time there's season, etc., in Hebrew. So my job was to translate that, or my senior thesis was to do the translation of the medieval Hebrew philosopher on the book of Ecclesiastes. And I'm saying that to say that's kind of where I was. And then 2 months later, I'm in the Navy. I'm sent to Marine Corps base, and it was a different world. It was a totally different world. But in the world of the military, I found from day one, many people, I'm looping all the way back, had never met a rabbi, never met any Jewish authority, and they were just filled with questions, And so ironically, that bolstered my faith in a way, because I said, okay, this was what I'm supposed to do. I always wanted to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And so the teaching part and the faith part came together. Yeah. And as a chaplain. Wow, that was a long answer.
No, I love that. So I started reading regularly several years ago now the writings of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks.
Right.
You're familiar with him?
Right.
I was so sad when he passed just a few years ago, because I've benefited so much, and he was one of the first to point out, help me observe in Exodus 33 and 34, Moses is having this encounter with God right after the golden calf scene,
right,
and he wants to see the Lord's face.
Right.
He wants to see His glory, and the Lord says, "You can't see my face, but I will show you my back." And Rabbi Sacks pointed out, we often can't see how God is working in the moment, but we can see His back. We can see where He's been. And it sounds like, looking back in your life, He has been in several key moments to lead you to this place right now and really doing amazing work. I mean, it is, I'd love to be able to spend even more time on that. Maybe we'll have a conversation in the future, but could you at least give a little bit more about the Jewish Christian Discovery Center, and that would kind of lead us into your book, which I've got right here.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that 10 years ago, if you had spoken to me about this, I'd just written a book about racism in the Supreme Court, racism in America and the Supreme Court, and was ready to do podcasts and things like that. And it just didn't work out. It didn't materialize for a number of reasons. And then, as I said before, most rabbis are not called in the sense that there's a voice telling them what to do, or it's dramatic like that. I think the calling is more benign, but nevertheless it's a calling. And I just felt compelled, as I said before, to educate Christians about their Jewish roots, only because I experienced it. And I think that it was unique in that regard that I met so many people in the military. Again, never met a rabbi, never met a Jewish person, and they weren't just saying, "Hi, how are you? Oh, you're a rabbi, that's great, have a nice day." Once they got to know you, then they said, "Can I ask you a question? I've always had a question about Jews and Judaism, and what do you believe about Jesus, whatever." And I saw that was ongoing, that never stopped. And so that made me realize that there was a need out there that was not being met. And in the world of Jewish organizations that deal with interfaith, very few people were doing the education that I thought about. It's always easy to condemn an act of anti-Semitism. I mean, everyone should condemn it. However, how do you prevent it? So my perspective was, if we're going to prevent something, we have to educate people. We have to tell them why it's not acceptable and why they shouldn't do it. So that got me into this process, and we, for the last 6 years, every few months have a different program. So we have something for Hanukkah and Christmas. I do a lot of speaking in churches. We produced a video called The Magical Encounter. It's on YouTube.
It's great.
And so we're and I've had books for children. I have 5 books for children. We have an activity book where they can color, they can write their own stories. The books were translated into Spanish. So we have a lot of activities, and the blessing of forming your own interfaith, if you get funding, is that you can be as creative as possible, and you're not constrained in any way. And unfortunately, as we know, the level of anti-Semitism is increasing, not decreasing. So sort of sadly, paradoxically, there's a greater need for the Jewish Christian Discovery Center.
Yeah, it's beautiful work, and I'm so glad that the work is becoming a process, maybe a process that will continue long after you're no longer here, and someone else will take up that mantle and continue. I pray that that's the case. But I want to come back to the book right now, because I love titles and subtitles, and you and I've talked about words and why they matter, and so I think you capture it so well in this. The title is A New Look at Rabbi Jesus, and I think the subtitle is very powerful. Jews and Christians finally reconnected.
Right.
That's the way that it should be. That's the way that it should have been from the beginning.
Right.
So could you just maybe provide a little bit of an overview of the book? I've read the book, and you can see my highlights and underlines in here. I thoroughly enjoyed it and have referenced it several times since reading it. Probably read it again. So
good.
Maybe give a little.
Well, just a few highlights. I mean, two of the highlights which are most interesting to my Christian friends is I talk about the education of Jesus. Yeah. It's so funny that I was once asked to read a movie script, be a writer on a script, and somehow people found me, and they gave me the script about Jesus. And as a child, they had him being a carpenter, an apprentice to his father, which is well known. But as I kept on reading the script, there was nothing about his education at all, as if he wasn't educated, if he was sort of an ignorant person who just would get the wood, buddy, whatever. And so I went back to the producers. I said, hey, I'm going to amend that. They said, go ahead. And they accepted it totally. And so
nice.
One of the points I make in the book is I talk about the education of Jesus. Now, here's what people ask me. They always ask me, how do you know that? How do you prove that? Yeah. So I want to take a step back and just say that almost everything in the book is historically based. So when I wrote this book, I took both sides of my Loyola education. So the one side was the interfaith degree. So I had read Matthew and different books of the Christian scriptures. And then on the history side, if you're teaching academic history, you just can't make things up. You have to prove what you're saying. So the Civil War began in April 1861. You can say it began in another month, but you're wrong, and I can prove to you you're wrong. So what I wanted to do is in the book, any assertion I make, I wanted it to be solid as possible.
Yeah.
So people say to me, well, how do you know that? And I say, well, that's the easy one. You take a lot of the early works of the rabbis, they wrote down, and again, I quote in the book, to highly educate your children. Mm-hmm. Not just a little bit, but highly educate your children. And so we know when he lived, so you just extrapolate out. So you take what was the standard for everyone and say, well, if it was the standard for everyone, then Jesus certainly would have done that. And then you have evidence in the Christian scriptures themselves where people are asking him very detailed religious questions. And he's giving very detailed answers. So he can't do that unless he'd studied. So I think that whole part of the book, section of the book about his education is very solid. And then I went back and I visited Israel to do this. I've been there a dozen times. But this trip specifically was to go back to Nazareth and investigate his geography. Just like we who live wherever we live, I don't think our whole lives are spent within 5 or 10 miles. Mm-hmm. There's big cities, there's metropolitan areas that have an influence on our lives. And so I do the same thing with Jesus.
I love that.
That where he lived, and again, that's, you can go back to Israel today and see some of those places and just use your imagination. Say, oh, I can envision him as an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, and all the influences that he had. So that's another part of the book. And frankly, another big section, which I wish we could study with our Christian friends all the time, is some of the prophecies, because I think we miss out that Jesus, I believe, very much saw himself in that line of the prophets. Uh-huh. I know the prophecies are used in the Christian belief to prove Jesus, but I also think on another level, we miss out his deliberately using the prophecies for himself to make the points he wanted to. So that's another section of the book. And finally, and I would say a fourth section is urging people to think creatively about some of the verses in the scriptures. And we call that midrash.
Yes.
So you take a verse in the Bible, and it may say whatever it says on its face, but then we have to dive into it and look at the history of it. Do we really want to say that verse exactly? Uh-huh. In the Christian scriptures, there's a lot of admonitions. If you don't follow the Sabbath, put to death. If you don't, if you're disrespectful to parents and teachers, put to death. Nobody would be alive at this point. So the rabbis in their commentaries say, well, that's just hyperbole, or let's look at these verses differently. So that's a few of the things in the book. I mean,
no, it's fantastic, and we're going to put a link in the description for people to be able to find this and read it for themselves, and hopefully, again, a new look at Rabbi Jesus. Now, for many people here, they're just beginning their investigation of Jesus. They're beginning to ask questions. So they either did not grow up either Jewish or Christian or religious at all, and so that's why they're coming to this podcast, is to begin to learn a little bit. And when they hear about the education of Jesus, very likely they can't help but think about their own education system, which is in classrooms, going from one grade to the next and having different teachers. And my understanding and study of just the discipleship model in first century Galilee is just very different from what our education system looks like today, being much more about transformation into the likeness of a rabbi, and less about just getting information, less about just knowing what the rabbi knows, but actually becoming like a rabbi. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think that Jesus' education was, in a way, parallel to what I described. In other words, we don't account for And this is so fascinating. I know for many Christians, they distinguish between the historical Jesus and the theological Jesus. And often when you go to church, the focus is on the theological Jesus.
Sure.
Jesus is God or Son of God.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that we're missing a lot. If you take all of us and take us where we stand today and say, how did you get there? Well, we have no choice but to look back and say, well, there's a number of things that happen in our lives that allow us to get to here. Be it parents and grandparents, somebody moved, something happened personally, a million things. And so I don't know why we don't do more of that investigation with Jesus as well. Yeah. Because I think that would give more richness to who he was and what he represented. So my guess is that, remember, when he starts out in the synagogues preaching. That's not unusual. We have people, if you go to a local synagogue, it's not unusual for people who have any interest in Judaism or they're in a Jewish club in college, whatever, for the rabbi to say, come and speak about that. Mm-hmm. Come and tell us what you experienced. So that whole phenomenon, I remember visiting Israel, Capernaum, which is right near the Sea of Galilee, one of the first places Jesus spoke. That's a relatively small synagogue. It's not a big one. And it was kind of eerie when I stood there. I felt very familiar because it's a synagogue. So the connection was established. But I imagine he went through the process of being highly educated, and yet he had a secular time where he went with his father, and he helped his father, who probably was more than a carpenter, maybe more like a builder. It's a little unclear what Joseph was. But when he went to the cities such as Sepphoris, which is a short walk away from Nazareth, he was in a big town, and he saw the amusements and the actors and the tradespeople, whatever, and he met with them and spoke with them, and they said, "Hey kid, get away, I have business," or whatever. I mean, he had that whole part of his life, and that taught him how to relate to people. It taught him about different people. So I think in a way we do a disservice by ignoring that and discounting that and not even learning about that. So my guess, and I never actually thought about it now, and it's so fascinating, is I think he evolved into that, where he became. I mean, if you know, one of the things I mentioned in the book is the so-called infancy gospels, which were not brought into the Christian scriptures. Yeah. But you have people in the first century thinking about Jesus as a kid. Yeah. Did he have like superpowers like Superman? Right. I mean, did he get hurt? Yeah. I mean, if he fell, did he bleed? Did he get cut and bleed? I mean, nobody really knows the answer to that, but it's fascinating to contemplate.
Did he ever step into a puddle, or did he just walk out?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, and you never hear, I mean, all the times I go to church services as a guest or whatever, very rarely, I don't know if people have spoken about that. And I must say we do the same thing with Moses. I mean, Moses is raised in the house of Pharaoh. Yeah. We have no idea what that was like. The Bible chooses not to tell you. Yeah. But that doesn't mean it wasn't significant. Yeah. Because when he becomes an adult, he identifies with the Israelites, not the Egyptians, even though he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. Yeah. So we have to kind of process that and say, how did that work out? So I really think it'd be wonderful for anybody in their faith journey to go back and just think about these things, because I really think that it enhances all our faith to go back and look at where we came from.
Yes, yes. And you mentioned Sepphoris, the city near Nazareth that Jesus surely would have gone to. If I remember right, you mentioned in the book, there's a theater there with like seating for 3,000 people or something like that. I thought that was so cool, just to be able to think about Jesus going with his family and others who live in Nazareth to go to the big city, or what would have been a bigger city from where they were, to go to the theater to see things. It makes it come to life, and so I really love that. I think it's in Numbers 11. There's a moment in which Moses is burdened again by the people's longing to go back to Egypt because they don't have the food that they want, and they're complaining about not having cucumbers and melons and leeks, and he's just burdened, and he asks the Lord, just kill me, just take me out. And the Lord takes some of his Spirit and puts it on the elders, and there's 70 elders. And one of the things that I have really appreciated about, and it's changed my view of looking at the Bible and looking at scriptures, that my inward desire is to look at them more black and white, because I want to know, well, what does that mean exactly?
Right.
And yet there's that moment of the Lord taking Moses' Spirit, putting it on the 70 elders, and there was some rabbi talked about that the scriptures is like a diamond with 70 facets.
Right.
And being able to look at it from each of these different facets, as those elders would have gone back to teach in a different way the people that they oversaw.
Right.
We need to look at scripture from multiple different perspectives to be able to truly see the whole. And that's something that I want to encourage our listeners here, as much as we desire to wrestle things down, as much as we value evidence that supports a certain claim, and we want to do that, we've got to look at multiple different perspectives to be able to understand that. And I think you make a great case for that approach in the book, and you're doing so now.
Well, if we could, I know we're in a podcast, but if I could just underline that and highlight that, because it's so frustrating to me when I read the Christian scriptures or I go to a church service and they're quoting verses. The way the Jewish mind thinks is, what questions do I have? How did people in the past look at this? So I take all that information and then I process it. So we process it in the world of 2024 today. And if we don't do that, I think we're missing, again, some of the richness of the verses. If we just take them and one-dimensionally interpret them, we're missing so much. And it's interesting to me that if you go to a Jewish service, 99% of the time, they're going to be reading from the Bible, and they're going to say, okay, here's what do we think it means. Here's what the people in the past thought it meant. Now, what do you think it means? Mm-hmm. But you have to go through the process. So the Jewish perspective often is to question. And that's a famous quote from a rabbi. Yeah, there's different ways of looking at it. Now, that doesn't negate the verse, but I think it gives us a fullness that is not there if somebody says, oh, it means this, period. Mm-hmm. This, period. Because that, in a way, locks out other people. And one of the things I bring up in the book is that it's not unusual for there to be people who disagree with Jesus, because the early rabbis, and by the way, he was a Pharisee or part of the Pharisaic party, in my opinion. I know Pharisees have a bad name among some people, but I think that's also a misinterpretation. But the whole point of that is they were developing a new religion that after the destruction of the temple, even though that's after Jesus has died, but even before he died, the rabbis would sit together like anybody, and there would be a difference of opinion. Mm-hmm. So that's not unusual that he would have one thought, somebody else would have another, somebody else would have another. I mean, that's very Jewish in a way.
Yeah.
So I really think that for people to take the scriptures and not say to their ministers, okay, what does it mean? And then, okay, we're done with services. But to take almost ownership of those verses and say, let us dive into those, let us read some history. Let's ask people.
Yeah.
Ask a few different people. So
yeah,
very good that you're articulating.
Well, I love it. You look back at Abraham and the father of both the Jewish faith and the Christian faith. We as Christians, we view that we've been grafted into his family tree.
Muslims too, for that.
Sure, yeah. And we see him questioning God in different points. I mean, when God is going to Sodom and Gomorrah, and he says, "Shall I tell Abraham what I'm about to do?" You know, why does the Lord say that? Except that he wanted Abraham to question him on it, and I just think that is so fundamental and so important. And those who are watching right now and who've been watching for a while have learned the value of questioning in a healthy way. We want to be good students and not immediately jump to being critics. but truly to learn and grow. So I imagine you learned a lot yourself, or reclarified things that you have believed going through this book process, and as you continue to work with the Jewish Christian Discovery Center. I'm curious, if you don't mind sharing your own personal opinions and even theological beliefs about Jesus specifically. I can see you have a high view of Jesus in many respects.
Right.
But what do you?
Well, in a way, it's kind of simple in a way that everything I described, that he was a highly educated, inspirational, legendary figure. Also, Messiah means you're anointed, and so as previous people were, as the kings of Israel were, as some of the prophets, anointed means oil is poured on you. We see him as that, and then we just sort of say, period. That from Jewish perspective, he was a person. He lived and he died. That's it. But because Christianity is based on Jesus, then we want to go the next step and sit with our Christian brothers and sisters and say, okay, how do we fit it together with that difference aside? And so I would say that, we may have different thoughts about who and what he was, but I'll show you how interesting this is historically. Jesus dies in what year? 32, 33, something like that. So now picture you're living in Jerusalem and it's the year 40. Now the temple's not going to be destroyed till the year 70. So, and the Romans are there, and they're attacking people and brutalizing people and crucifying people as they did routinely. I know that the conversations some of the Jewish community were having at that time was about Jesus and his followers, because the Messiah meant that there was going to be a time of peace in the world. So some of the people were saying, I'm sure some of the people said, well, he didn't meet that criterion of the Messiah because the Romans are still killing us. And then other people were saying, yes, but we still believe in his teachings, etc. So this disagreement about Jesus and who and what he was, I think goes all the way back. But it should be a family conversation is stepping back and say, well, Jesus was Jewish. He lived a Jewish life. He practiced Judaism. He died, and there were Jewish rituals that were held. So we need to look at that, all the connections we have. And I think, unfortunately, we look at that one area of disagreement about who and what he was, and that defines who we are. And it's sad, because we should be a family, and the family can have disagreements, but we're still ultimately a family.
Yeah. So we think about at Christmas time, right? And whether you are Christian or not Christian, religious, not religious, doesn't matter. Many people in the U.S., in the West especially, will celebrate Christmas time, and it's a time of thinking about peace.
Right.
And so you talked about the Messiah coming to bring peace, and people think about Christmas bringing peace. But Jesus actually said something rather different. He said, I didn't come to bring peace, but to bring the sword. And father turned against son, mother turned against daughter.
Right.
And it's a really tense passage even for Christians to read, because we just, that division that Jesus says he came to bring causes us to go, what does that mean? And one of the things is that Jesus is claiming something about himself. He's claiming to be that Messiah. So I think that's probably where that tension is, and we as imperfect humans often don't live well in that tension or have those types of conversations. So I just wanted to come back to the Messiah part. Have you ever wondered yourself, could Jesus really have been the Messiah that the prophets foretold, who is going to establish that new covenant, like from Jeremiah? Do you see what I'm saying? Do you?
Yeah, let's go back. And I reference those verses you mentioned in my book because, listen, I think sometimes we make the mistake of we read the Bible as if it's a novel and that a single author wrote it. But the truth is, academically, there's a number of sources. There's a number of authors who are writing at different times.
Yeah, and likely many editors who came back and
so that those verses were father against the child, which, by the way, is sort of contradicted in many other places. The end of Malachi, there's going to be a time of peace. I think those verses just reflect some of the ongoing conversations that people were having, which became very heated. I mean, don't forget, they're living under Roman occupation.
Yeah,
people are being killed.
It's so hard to
imagine.
imagine.
If you just say, okay, there were some parts of the community who said, we need to fight these people actively. There were other parts that said, well, let's just go along and maybe this will disappear. And there are others who said, well, let's just become Roman and assimilate. So those three opinions would have created controversy. So I think sometimes we forget that there were emotions here, that there were raw emotions. And Jesus, in many cases, is not admired by some people who say, no, we disagree with you. We just disagree with you. And those verses, I think, are the verses we should dive into, as in the Hebrew Bible, where I mentioned before, you have death if you don't follow the law. And then you go into it and say, okay, what was going on at the time? Let's try to reconstruct that period. So I think it does reflect the reality of his life. Again, for me, somebody asked me this recently. They said, you're a rabbi? I said, yes. Actually, I was at a social event. I'm sure you've been in there, and people find out who you are.
Yeah.
He took me off to the side. Said, I've always wanted to ask this. He said, Jewish people believe that the Messiah will come at some point, and Christians say a second coming. Which is it? I said, I don't really care, because if the Messiah is going to come, the backdrop to that will be peace in the world. I mean, the Messiah can't come when there's fighting going on. The world has to do its own work to get ready for the Messiah. So in many ways, I just leave that question off to the side. If I'm going to get peace and the world will be at peace, whether it's first coming or second coming, I'm okay, because then it'll be a time of universal peace. We should also dive a little bit into Isaiah chapter 11, which talks about the definitions of messiahship. Is that his wistful thinking, like we say, in an ideal world. We say that in English. In an ideal world, here's how things would be. So is that Isaiah saying, okay, I'm going to paint you a picture of what the world could be. Maybe Star Trek-y in the future, that sort of thing. And that is your goal that you aspire to. But you never get there, but you aspire to that inspiration. So there's a lot to look at. I think, unfortunately, the problem is that the definition of Messiah is linked back to this time of peace, that there will be peace. And unfortunately, as we know from history, it didn't exist. So again, I'm just jumping on with the people at that time who are having the same conversation. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the difference of opinion should simply be that. Yeah. Because one of the points I make when I reviewed Matthew is that Jesus is asked the greatest commandments. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, from Deuteronomy 6. And then he says back in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. And that, to me, he talks a lot about forgiveness, those themes of forgiveness and loving your neighbor. So that, to me, is sort of the essence of it. So we may disagree about whether he was the Messiah, and then we have to wrestle with the fact that there wasn't peace. So was there a different definition of Messiah? And how does it work out if people who believe in the Trinity, and they say three gods? I once asked one of my professors at Loyola, he was a priest, I said, Father, tell me about the Trinity. He said, Rabbi, it's a mystery. So I kind of laughed a little bit. I said, I said, well, that's what you tell everyone, but really, what's the truth? And then his face got very serious. He said, no, it's a mystery. Okay. three gods in one, but gods are infinite. So logically, it's hard to have three infinite beings. But you just accept it on faith and move on. What saddens me the most is that our disagreements about what some of our core beliefs we should never allow them to put us in a negative place. We should never allow it to say, well, here's what we believe, and what we believe is right. And I hate the word right or wrong, because now you're on the academic history side. Just say, here's what we believe.
Yeah.
Now, there are people who are going to believe differently, and how do we view them? Again, if you view them as a brother and sister, it's all okay. It's okay to have those different beliefs. So that's sort of I think the challenge for people of faith is ultimately, how do we see the other? Maybe someone who believes differently. And again, I talk in the book, I write a little parable about Jesus coming back. And I meet him in a park. I don't know really he's Jesus, but that's the point, that I think he's Jesus. And he's pointing down to a Bible, and he's in Leviticus, love your neighbors yourself, and he's crying. And I say, and I ask him, I said, is everything a matter? What's the matter? And he says, my people have disappointed me. They got it wrong. And so I'm trying to say that if somebody calls themselves a person of faith, is there really room in there for prejudice? It seems to me such a basic contradiction.
Yes. No, that's I appreciate that. You mentioned a minute ago about people pulling you aside. I'm sure that happens all the time. They hear you're a rabbi, they want to pull you aside and ask their big question, and I'm sure you get a lot of gotcha type questions, and we're not interested in that here. When people pull me aside as a pastor, it's often to ask, is this a sin? And they'll ask this because quite frankly, they often want to snuggle up as close to sin as they can without crossing the line.
Right.
And so I generally just don't answer the question. I'll point them back to Scripture and help them make a decision for themselves. But in talking about Jesus coming as Messiah, a first coming, a second coming, and that the Messiah was to bring peace, that is how I understand it. Is the first coming may not have looked like what some anticipated, but that he did come to bring peace with the Lord, peace with God as it relates to our sin. And Jesus caused the mass conversion of the pagan world to the God of Israel, which is just incredible to think about. I mean, he caused the mass conversion of the pagan world to the God of Israel. That's incredible. How could he have done this? In the way that I see it, and the way that I experienced it in my life and seen it in other people's life, is that he did come to bring peace with God, and that one day he will return to bring that more physical peace that I think we were talking about on the day of the Lord, when he comes again to judge the living and the dead. Those are my own personal beliefs, and I've come to those beliefs just looking at the evidence. I'm curious, is there what evidence would you need to see to be able to see Jesus as having come and be the Messiah that was prophesied?
I don't know. That's hard, because we're talking 2,000 years already.
Yeah.
And again, as a historian, I don't know if we can point to any time in history where we'd say, well, we'd like to be, I wish I could live at that time. I mean, unfortunately, there's always been periods of warfare, periods of prejudice, periods of hate. So I don't know if we've gotten to the place where we should be. And I'll tell you a poignant story which kind of shows where I am a little bit. I was the first time I went to Israel, 1973. I was in college. And I had just passed my Red Cross water safety instructor training. I haven't spoken about this in years. And I had a patch from the Red Cross on my bathing suit. So we're in Tel Aviv, and we're walking to the beach. And a lady, as I'm walking to the beach, there's a lady coming the other way. And all of a sudden, she starts screaming at me, and she starts saying stuff in Hebrew and pointing to my suit. And she said, maza, which means like, what's that? So I thought, you look down, it's, gosh, did it slip off or something?
Yeah.
And I didn't understand her. And then she came closer. And I realized she was pointing to the symbol of the Red Cross. The action, and it's just, to me, it's a plus sign. It's not a cross.
Right, yeah.
And from the little bit of Hebrew I spoke and then she spoke was that, and really it affected her enormously. She had been a victim of the Holocaust, and she had gone to a church, and the church had turned her over to the Nazis and all that sort of stuff. And she had this antagonism to the church, and that's what the cross represented. And so that's sort of the opposite of what the world should be. So if to answer your question, again, it's if the Messiah came and then somehow tomorrow, and we ended the wars in the Middle East, we ended the wars in Ukraine, we ended the antagonism in our own country, it seems, and all these issues were resolved, then I'd be willing to say, okay, whomever it is, fine, I'll sign up for that, because then we would have this sort of peace we were talking about. So I just think we're going to have different opinions about that. But at the end of the day, I go back to, and I think you and I spoke about this, we're talking about God after all. And there's so much infinitude about that on one hand, that God created the universe, and yet day by day we see that bad things do happen to good people, and accidents and deaths and illness and prejudice and hostages and all that sort of thing. So for me, I think faith will end up being an ongoing process with a little bit of struggle mixed in there about how does it all fit together. There's a famous story about Mother Teresa, who kept, worked in India and did all that work, and she kept journals. And when she passed, her followers were anxious to look at the journals because they said, oh, Mother Teresa, what'd she say? And she was writing like page after page, in effect, okay, God, I'm doing everything I think I should be doing, and I'm waiting to meet you, and I'm waiting to get that divine sign, and it never came. It never came for her, and that she keeps on writing and say, here I am, give me the sign, show me that what I'm doing is right.
Yeah.
So I think in many ways for us, and again from a Jewish perspective, we look at our Christian friends or Muslim friends, anything, and we say, have at it. I mean, believe what you want and just give us enough peace to worship as we see fit, and we'll all worship differently, and life will go on. And I think, unfortunately, we often feel on the defensive that sort of people are coming over the top and saying, well, why don't you believe this way, or why don't you believe this, or your prophets say, and so in a way, I think for most people, if you ask most Jews, they say, hey, we just want to be part of the overall society. Don't forget, historically, Jewish people were not part of society. If you go from post-70 all the way to the 1800s and 1900s, to be a Jew meant that you were sort of literally outside of society, either physically off by the side. And if you study the Middle Ages, there were the Crusades, and Jewish communities were attacked along the way. Later on, there would be pogroms. And your physical security was only maintained by whomever was in power. So if there was a local king or bishop or whatever, remember, medieval Europe was not organized in the country. It was much smaller units. So if that person said, yes, I'll protect you, then you were protected. But when that person passed, the next ruler might say, no, you're out. And they would physically push you out to the end of the territory, 30, 40 miles away. And then you were out in the world. Wow. So Jews, remember, 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but 1492 was the year the Jews were expelled from Spain. And then where did they go? And then you had the Inquisition, which was torturing people who said, I'm a Christian, and maybe on a Friday night they lit a candle, something like that. So for the last 1900 years, for the Jewish community, there were times of peace. Make no mistake. But there was not an America. There was not a world where you said, I identify as a Canadian who happens to be Jewish, American who happens to be Jewish. Your main identity was your ethnicity and the reality of being able to spend a whole life in the same geographic spot was not guaranteed.
Yeah.
So that's why history is important to study, and that's why the lady got so spun up. And yes, for our Christian friends, where were they during the Holocaust?
Yeah.
And who had friends, who had colleagues and neighbors that you knew. It wasn't like they were unknown. Literally your neighbors. So this prejudice, that's the antithesis of the piece you're describing.
Look back through those moments, especially the Holocaust, is such a failure of responsibility to step up and to love your neighbor as yourself, as you point back to. I want to honor your time, and I've only got like one or two more questions.
Okay.
But one of the things I truly love about this conversation and about you specifically is the being comfortable wrestling with ideas.
Right.
And one of the things that we wrestle with on the Investigate Jesus podcast is the idea of sin, and what do we do with our sin? And so, what are your thoughts on that? What do we do with our sin? In the times where we haven't loved our neighbor as ourselves,
Right.
and we have actually caused more harm in the world. We've not treated people as if they were made in the image of God. Whether we feel guilty about that or not, it's the Lord who judges. And so what do we do with that?
Well, the two quick answers. One is we do have a holiday coming up in about a month called Yom Kippur, which means Day of Atonement. So we have a formal process for doing that. So in our prayers, and also on a daily basis, there are literally ways where we say, forgive us if we've sinned, forgive us if we've done something wrong. But I think that we all need to do a self-check, a self-analysis about that, because it's not a matter of simply saying, I've sinned, now how do I deal with that? How do I get some sort of resolution of that? But I think we have to have the awareness that sin can lead to prejudice, can lead to hatred. I mean, there's a price of sin if the sin is within this realm of how we believe about the other. So I would say for most people, take it to heart and go to someone, someone you really trust, a mentor, a spiritual guide, and say, help me with this. What we say at our Day of Atonement is at the end of it, you're supposed to be cleansed. And we literally have page after page of sins that people do. But you're not supposed to loop back and do them all again. I mean, you're supposed to be better. So I think it is, I mean, I think that we probably don't give sin enough recognition. Because in my opinion, the forces of hatred and prejudice are quite tenacious. And so conversations like we're having today are not only educational, but they're beneficial because we push back against the ignorance. We push back against the prejudice. And again, we want to anchor ourselves. I think it's fair to say to people, what's your bottom line? What's your bottom line? And imagine how different the world would be. The Messiah would be closer, or many rabbis talk about a messianic age. They don't talk about a person. But think how our society would be if we say, love your neighbor as yourself. That's easy to say but hard to do, because you're going to look at someone else and say, okay, if that was me, how would I want to be treated in whatever the situation was? And I presume our standards would be pretty high. I presume we'd want to be treated in a humane and dignified way. But we need to anchor ourselves in that. Unless we do, then unfortunately, the prejudices will continue. I mean, history is not linear. I wish it was, and I wish we were going better through time and going upwards. But I think it's more circular. And as we see with the increased anti-Semitism, that's part of it. Now it's so if people have the sins, try to process them out, get smarter about it, and try not to do it again.
Yeah. And you talk about just the cost of sin, and we see that in Genesis 3, the Lord coming to Adam and Eve. They've chosen to eat from the tree they were not supposed to.
Right.
And part of that cost, while there's many costs to it, part of that cost is they couldn't live in the garden anymore.
Right.
Moreover, when they realize that they're naked and they're shame before Yahweh, they grab some leaves from a fig tree and they're trying to cover themselves. And something that really stands out to me is that they couldn't truly cover themselves. Yahweh had to clothe them. Right. And a sacrifice had to be made. He made them clothes of skin. So something had to die in order for them to be clothed in proper clothing to cover their shame. And of course we see as the sacrificial system plays out, obviously Abraham and his kind of the blood path that he had to walk, which ends up forming the sacrificial system that we see in Leviticus. That sacrificial system stopped in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. And we've talked a little bit about this, and at some point we'll talk more about it because I know there's a whole lot to cover there. But I guess I struggle with the idea, as much as I completely agree with love your neighbor as yourself, and when you have these sins, try to do better next time. I completely agree with that. There's still something that's not fully satisfied for me in that, because the world thinks about just be a good person, right? And I know that's not really what you're saying. You're saying there's something more to that. It's not just about just being a good person, because if it's just about being a good person and that all of the good things you do would outweigh all of the bad things you do, I mean, that's not what we believe. Ultimately, if that was the case, that's permission to keep doing sin, as long as the good outweighs the bad, right? So we still have to have something that resolves that sin. To me, and it's just what I believe and what I hope others will come to believe, is seeing that Jesus is the Lord come down in the flesh to take the blame for our sins.
Right. Once
and finally, sacrificial system is not needed anymore. And even the temple itself, when Jesus died, the temple veil tears, right? Tears into and allows entrance back in for all of us, back into that garden where Adam and Eve were exiled from it.
So there's going to be a big finish now, because I think we're on to something fascinating. I see Genesis differently, and I'll tell you why. When I was in college, I walked into a classroom. When I told you I attended 2 colleges, and on the board it said Akkadian Mesopotamia. And I said, I'm in the wrong classroom because I'm here to study Bible. They said, no, you're in the right classroom. This is the world of Abraham and Sarah. This is the world which existed at the time. And I came to learn that there were a number of creation stories. Like Adam and Eve.
Yep.
And there was a talking snake. There was a talking donkey we know with Bilam.
Yeah.
And so my point is that tree is a tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
And I think what our ancient ancestors were trying to grapple with is the same thing that you and I are trying to grapple with. How does evil exist in the world? And so Adam and Eve had to eat that apple or peach or whatever it was. They had to have that awareness. So that awareness is that evil does exist. So for me, the purpose of that is our ancient ancestors were trying to figure out the reality of evil, the source of evil, the source of prejudice. And so that story is their way of explaining. I mean, look how sad it is. Cain kills Abel. I mean, right away.
It's awful. Yeah.
And so you have the acknowledgement of the existence of evil, and then you have the first evil act right away.
Right away. Yeah.
And so I think for me, that story is making us all aware that evil exists in the world, period.
Yeah.
And it's still existing. I mean, again, if you look at it historically, there's no time we can look at and say, oh, if we only lived then. So our struggle, I think, is we're not going to live in the Garden of Eden. I don't think, because that's not real. We live finite lives. We don't live infinite lives. We're hungry. We have to use the bathroom. We fall, we bleed, and we're also, things that we do are sinful. So I think, however, our task is to know that the Garden of Eden exists, either symbolically or metaphorically, and our lives should be going toward that garden, going toward that original pure place. Knowing, see, it's even harder actually, if we acknowledge that sin exists, or evil exists, or prejudice, then we have to actively fight it. And you could take this paradigm and say, even in relationships, there can be evil in marital relationships, there can be sin. So how do I fight that? So I think that for us, we're still in that place of where we're maybe in the garden, but we've acknowledging sin, and now we have to fight the fight. We have to fight the fight of making our lives as holy as they can be, as pure as they can be, as sinless as they can be, but also knowing that the tendency toward evil still exists. And it may always exist. And by the way, on another level, that's sort of God limiting him or herself in a way by creating people with the existence of evil and also with the existence of free will. So if somebody is determined to smoke, which I hope nobody does, but if they're determined to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, that's going to have an impact. You can't go to church or synagogue and say, okay, God, I want to live to 100 years. Now I'm going to light up. No, your free will is making you do that. So on that level, and that would roll back to sort of the role of Jesus, etc., we may see that differently. But in either case, a belief in God would be fundamental to getting us closer, I think, back to the garden. So
I love that. I love that concept, because even though I grew up in church and I grew up in a Christian family and we valued Bible study and things, there's so many pieces to it. I didn't put it all together that for a while, that idea of getting back to what God originally intended in the garden. Right. The problem is not just though our sin that allows us to not live in the garden, but that God himself put outside the garden a cherubim and a flaming sword. So we have this fight, but we also have an obstacle that the Lord is preventing us to come back into that. And that was so eye-opening for me in looking at the tabernacle and its construction and how it models the garden imagery of a garden that's in Eden and then the rest of the world in the same way, an outer court, an inner court, and then the Holy of Holies. And on that veil going into the Holy of Holies are cherubim that are embroidered on that veil. And that only the high priest could go in once a year on the Day of Atonement and tie a rope around him just in case something happened, have to pull him back. And that was just so eye-opening, and why I believe the Lord is so poetic is when Jesus died on that temple veil, going from the tabernacle to the temple, on that veil was still those cherubim. But now that it's torn, it's like saying to those cherubim, you're no longer needed anymore because that sacrifice has been made. And you can all come back into the garden now until the time when I return. So it's the kingdom is now, but not yet fully. Right. And that's the idea of the second coming. So I just think it's so beautiful, and
it is, because we're all in the garden or we're outside the garden, but we all need to be sort of holding hands and marching together. And that's what we're not doing. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you think about it, only Moses went up to Mount Sinai in the first version. So I think that, and the people stayed below. So our lives may be filled with all sorts of challenges to get through those cherubim and the fire. And we may not make it into the garden, but our task is to say, but we took a step closer. We got 3 steps closer for our children and grandchildren, so their starting point is a little bit closer. So every good deed we do, every embrace we have with somebody, every conversation like this is helping, I think, people get a little bit closer to that garden.
Rabbi, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for your willingness. You are such a kind and gentle person, and I think you have a very calming effect. And I hope that people will experience that calming effect, just through this medium here, even though they won't get to meet you in person. And I would absolutely love to have you back on this podcast, because what we're doing right now is we're looking at some of the claims made about Jesus, and we really need a Jewish perspective. And I can already see several things coming up that will make people scratch their heads, but having a Jewish perspective is kind of that aha moment of, oh, that makes so much more sense why he said that, why they responded that way. And so if you'd be willing,
It'd be my pleasure.
I'd love to have you back on. One thing I want to do right before we go, I guess two little things, if you don't mind. One is, what guidance would you give this audience as they continue to investigate Jesus going forward?
Just stay in touch. I mean, read the book. I mean, I think that it's funny. Somebody said they go to church and they want to get the Spirit of God. And then when I told them what I was doing, they said, oh, that's wonderful. You're giving us the wisdom of God, that when we go to church, we should get the wisdom and the Spirit. So I think educate yourselves. I mean, I started out page 3 of the book trying to get a date of when Matthew was written, which seems like straightforward. And I looked at 4 Christian scholars, and they all had different dates.
Right, yeah.
So that in itself is an education. So I would say just investigate and read and study, listen to podcasts, do what you can to make yourself smarter.
Yes, that's great. Well, we want to help people make an informed decision about Jesus. You have definitely helped in that. I'd love for them to be able to read your book. Where is the best place that they can find the book, A New Look at Rabbi Jesus?
Our whole world is Google. You could Google it or go on Amazon. If it turns out to be too expensive, contact you and you'll contact me, and we'll get them a copy. But it's out there in the world. I made it as a paperback, and it shouldn't be that expensive. So I think also it's available on Kindle as well.
Excellent.
So
that's great. Multiple ways you can access it. Please go check out A New Look at Rabbi Jesus by my friend Rabbi Albert Slomovitz. And Rabbi, thank you. I look forward to our next conversation.
I look forward to it too.
Thanks.